The Mongol retribution came so swiftly and was so ferocious that it completely demoralized Muhammad Shah, the ruler of Khwarazm, spelled Khwarazm, whose arrogance brought death and destruction to his kingdom on an appalling scale. Muhammad Shah had scoffed at Genghis Khan's demand for retribution for the plunder and slaughter of a Mongol caravan that had entered Khwarazm in 1218, map 14.1. Genghis Khan had personally dispatched the caravan as a signal that he wished to establish political and commercial relations with Khwarazm, having in effect declared war on the Mongols by ignoring their demands for just recompense. Muhammad Shah compounded his folly by quarreling with the Caliph of Baghdad, who consequently had little inclination to come to his rescue. Caught off guard by the Mongol assault that drove deep into his empire from several directions, Muhammad Shah was at first immobilized with fear, and then in full flight, leaving his hapless subjects to fend for themselves. Columns of battle-hardened Mongol cavalry besieged, then stormed one after another of the legendary cities that were the glory of Khwarazm. Bukhara was taken in early 1220 after its Turkish garrison was eliminated. Several months later, most of the inhabitants of Samarkand, who had initially attempted to resist the invaders, were massacred. The Mongols inundated Gurjang, spelled Gurgang, Gurgang, the former capital of Khwarazm, which they won after an extended siege by opening the floodgates of a nearby river, and the ancient citadel of Bamiyan, where Genghis Khan's much-loved grandson was killed by a defender's arrow, was obliterated and given the name Accursed City. Over the time, the mass slaughters, often dramatized by references to pyramids of skulls and the destruction of Khwarazm's ancient cities, became defining features in accounts of the sudden emergence of the nomadic Mongols as conquerors of much of Eurasia. Until quite recently, most histories have depicted these and similar Mongol conquests as savage assaults by backward and barbaric peoples on ancient and highly developed centers of human civilization. But even the Khwarazm campaign, which was certainly one of the most violent launched by Mongol forces, provides ample illustration of another side of the Mongol Imperium. Traditionally, the Mongols' contributions to cross-cultural exchange and human adherence have been neglected by historians. But in many of the cities of Khwarazm, where the population resisted and was killed wholesale, skilled artisans were spared in the thousands. Some of these were sent to the Mongol capital at Karakorum. Others carried their skills throughout the empire, and both manufacturing and commerce soon thrived under the aegis of Mongol rule. The century and a half of Mongol dominance also saw a revitalization of commerce and urban life in places like Bukhara and Samarkand along the Silk Road. The great trading network that had for millennia linked China and East Asia with the Middle East, India, and Europe. See the visualizing the past feature. Without question, the price of Muhammad Shah's treachery and resistance that opened the way to his new renewal was high, perhaps intolerable. But it is important to take fully into account the constructive aftermath of Mongol expansionism in Khwarazm, and other regions. As we shall see in this chapter, the Mongols very often exhibited great curiosity and openness towards the people and cultures that they conquered. And perhaps none of them exemplified these qualities more than the founder of the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan himself, who sought to attract philosophers and religious scholars from throughout Eurasia and his capital at Karakorum. He delighted in questioning them and debating their merits and drawbacks of different belief systems. In Samarkand and other cities where Muslim scholars and mosque attendants refused to encourage resistance, they were usually left unharmed and permitted to attend the spiritual and physical needs of the survivors. In the aftermath of the Mongol invasion, the privileging of religious leaders was reflected in broad tolerance on the part of these nomadic overlords for the diverse faiths and ethnic groups that had come under their rule. As we will argue in this chapter, though the Mongols were indeed fierce fighters and capable of terrible acts of retribution against those who dared to defy them, their conquests brought much more than death and devastation. At the peak of their power, the domains of the Mongol Khans made up a vast realm in which once hostile peoples lived together in peace, and most religions were tolerated. From the Khanate of Persia in the west to the empire of the fabled Kublai Khan in the east, the law code promulgated by Genghis Khan gave order to human interaction. Like the Islamic expansion that preceded it, the Mongol explosion laid the foundations for human interaction on a global scale, extending and intensifying the world network that had been building since the Classical Age. The transcontinental empire of Genghis Khan. In most ways, the Mongols epitomized nomadic society and culture. Their survival depended on the well-being of the herds of goats and sheep they drove from one pasture area to another according to the cycle of the seasons. Their staple foods were the meat and milk products provided by their herds, supplemented in most cases by grain and vegetables gained through trade with sedentary farming peoples. They also traded hides and dairy products for jewelry, weapons, and cloth made in urban centers. They dressed in sheepskins, made boots from tanned sheep hides, and lived in round felt tents made of wool sheared from their animals. Figure 14.2. The tough little ponies they rode to round up their herds, The tough little ponies they rode to round up their herds, hunt wild animals, and make war were equally essential to their way of life. Mongol boys and girls could ride as soon as they were able to walk. Mongol warriors could ride for days on end, sleeping and eating in the saddle. Like the early Arabs and other nomadic peoples we have encountered, the basic unit of Mongol society was the tribe, which was divided into kin-related clans whose members camped and herded together on a regular basis. When threatened by external enemies or preparing for raids on other nomads or invasions of sedentary areas, clans and tribes could be combined in great confederations. Depending on the skills of their leaders, these confederations could be held together for months or even years. But when the threat had passed or the raiding was done, clans and tribes drifted back to their own pasture lands and campsites. At all organizational levels, leaders were elected by the free men of the group. Although women exercised influence within the family and had the right to be heard in all tribal councils, men dominated leadership positions. Courage in battle, usually evidenced by bravery in the hunt and the ability to forge alliances and attract dependents, were vital leadership skills. A strong leader could quickly build up a large following of chiefs from other clans and tribal groups. If the leader grew old and feeble or suffered severe reverses, his subordinate would quickly abandon him. He expected this to happen, and the subordinate felt no remorse. Their survival and that of their dependents hinged on attaching themselves to a strong tribal leader. The making of a great warrior, the earlier career of Genghis Khan. Since the early millennia of recorded history, noble people speaking Mongolian languages had enjoyed moments of power and had actually carved out regional kingdoms in North China in the 4th and 10th century CE. In the early 12th century, Genghis Khan, great-grandfather Kublai Khan, led a Mongol alliance that won glory for defeating an army sent against them by the Jin Kingdom of North China. Soon after the victory, Kublai Khan became ill and died. His successor neither defeat their nomadic enemies nor hold the Mongol alliance together. Divided and beaten, the Mongols fell in hard times. Genghis Khan, who as a youth was named Temujin, was born in the 1170s into one of the splinter clans that fought for survival in the decades after death of Kublai Khan. Temujin's father was an able leader who built up a decent following and negotiated a promise of marriage between his eldest son and the daughter of a strong Mongol chief. According to Mongol accounts, just when the family fortunes seemed to be on the upsweep, Temujin's father was poisoned by agents of a rival nomadic tribe. Suddenly, Temujin, who was still a teenager, was thrust into a position of leadership, but most of the chiefs who had attached themselves to his father's refusal to follow a mere boy, whose prospects of survival appeared to be slim. In the months that followed, Temujin's much-reduced encampment was threatened and finally attacked by a rival tribe. He was taken prisoner in 1182, locked into a wooden collar, and held in humiliation to the camp of his enemies. After a daring midnight escape, Temujin rejoined his mother and brothers and found refuge in his tiny band of followers deep in the mountains. Facing extermination, Temujin did what any sensible nomad leader would have done. He and his people joined the camp of a more powerful Mongol chieftain who had once been aided by Temujin's father. With the support of his powerful leader, Temujin avenged the assaults of the clan that had enslaved him, and another that had taken advantage of his weakness to raid his camp for horses and women. These successes and Temujin's growing reputation as a warrior and military commander soon won him allies and clan chiefs eager to attach themselves to a leader with a promising future. Figure 14.3. Within a decade, the youthful Temujin had defeated his Mongol rivals and routed the forces sent to crush him by another nomadic peoples. In 1206, at a Kurulta, or meeting of the Mongol chieftains, Temujin, renamed Genghis Khan, was elected the Khagan, or supreme ruler, of the Mongol tribes. United under a strong leader, the Mongols prepared to launch a massive assault on an unsuspecting world. Building the Mongol war machine. The men of the Mongol tribes that had elevated Genghis Khan to leadership were natural warriors. Trained from youth not only to ride, but also to hunt and fight, they were physically tough, mobile, and accustomed to killing and death. They wielded a variety of weapons, including lances, hatchets, and iron maces. None of their weapons was as devastating as their powerful short bows, and a Mongol warrior could fire a quiver of arrows with a stunning accuracy without breaking the stride of his horse. He could hit enemy soldiers at as distant as 350 yards. The range for the roughly contemporary English longbow was 250 yards, while ducking under the belly of his pony or leaning over the horse's rump. The fact that the Mongol armies were entirely cavalry meant that they moved so rapidly with their advances alone could be demoralizing to enemy forces. To people whose very lifestyle bred mobility, physical courage, and a love for combat, Genghis Khan and his many able subordinate commanders brought organization, discipline, and unity of command. The old quarrels and vendettas between clans and tribes were overridden by loyalty to the Khagan. Thus, energies once devoted to infighting were now directed toward conquest and the forcible exaction of tribute, both in areas controlled by other nomadic groups and in the civilized centers that frightened the steppes on all sides. The Mongol forces were divided into armies made up of basic fighting units called tumans, each consisting of 10,000 warriors. Each tumen was further divided into units of 1,000, 110 warriors. Commanders at each level were responsible for training, arming, and disciplining the cavalrymen under their charge. The tumens were also divided into heavy cavalry, which carried lances and wore some metal armor, and light cavalry, which relied primarily on bow and arrow and leather helmets and body covering. Even more lightly armed were the scouting parties that rode ahead of Mongol armies, and using flags and special signifiers, kept the main force informed of enemy movements. Genghis Khan also created a separate messenger force whose bodies were tightly bandaged to allow them to remain in the saddle for days, switching from horse to horse to carry urgent messages between the Khagan and his commanders. Military discipline had long been secured by personal ties between commanders and ordinary soldiers. Mongol values, which made courage in battle a prerequisite for male self-esteem, was buttressed by a formal code that dictated the immediate execution of a warrior who deserted his unit. Genghis Khan's swift executions left little doubt about the fate of traitors to his own curse or turncoats, who abandoned enemy commanders in his favor. His generosity to brave foes was also legendary. The most famous of the latter, a man named Jebe, spelled Jebe, nicknamed the Arrow, won the Khagan's affection and high posts in the Mongol armies by standing his ground after his troops had been routed and fiercely shooting Genghis Khan's horse out from under him. A special unit supplied Mongol armies with excellent maps of the areas they were to invade. These were drawn largely according to the information supplied by Genghis Khan's extensive network of spies and informers. New weapons, including a variety of flame and exploding arrows, gunpowder projectiles, and later bronze cannons, were also devised for the Mongol forces by the time Genghis Khan's armies rode east and west in search of plunder and conquest in the second decade of the 13th century. They were among the best armed and trained and the most experienced, disciplined, and mobile soldiers in the world. Conquest, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan. When he was proclaimed the Khagan in 1206, Temujin probably was not yet 40 years old. At that point, he was the supreme ruler of nearly 1.5 million Mongols and the overlord of 1 to 2 million more nomads who had been defeated by his armies or had allied themselves with this promising young commander. But Genghis Khan had much greater ambitions. He once said that his greatest pleasure in life was making war, defeating enemies, forcing their beloved to weep, riding on their horses, embracing their wives and daughters. He came to see himself and his sons as men marked for a special destiny, warriors born to conquer the known world. In 1207, he set out to fulfill this ambition. His first campaign humbled the Tangut kingdom of Shishaya in northwest China, map 14.1, whose ruler was forced to declare himself a vassal of Khagan and pay a hefty tribute. Next, the Mongol armies attacked the much more powerful Jin Empire, which the Manchu-related Jurchens had established a century earlier in North China. In these campaigns, the Mongol armies were confronted for the first time with large fortified cities whose inhabitants assumed they could easily withstand the assault of these uncouth nomads from the steppes. Indeed, the Mongol invaders were thwarted at first by the intricate defensive works that the Chinese had perfected over the centuries to deter nomadic incursions. But the adaptive Mongols, with the help of captured Chinese artisans and military commanders, soon devised a whole arsenal of siege weapons. These including battering rams, catapults that hurled rocks and explosive balls, and bamboo rockets that spread fire and fear in besieged towns. Genghis Khan and early Mongol commanders had little regard for these towns, whose inhabitants they saw as soft. Therefore, when they met resistance, the Mongols adopted a policy of terrifying retribution. Although the Mongols also often spared the lives of famous scholars whom they employed as advisors and artisans with particularly useful skills, towns that fought back were usually sacked once they had been taken. The townspeople were slaughtered or sold into slavery. Their homes, palaces, mosques, and temples were reduced to rubble. Towns that surrendered without a fight usually spared this fate, although they were required to pay tribute to their Mongol conquerors as the price of their deliverance. The first assault on the Islamic world. Once they had established a foothold in North China and solidified their empire in the steppes, the Mongol armies moved westward against the Kirakita Empire, which had been established by a Mongolian-speaking people a century earlier. Map 14.1. Having overwhelmed and annexed the Kirakita by 1219, and, as we have seen, provoked by Muhammad Shah, Genghis Khan led his army to the conquest of Khwarezm. Let me read that sentence. Having overwhelmed and annexed the Kirakita by 1219, and, as we have seen, provoked by Muhammad Shah, Genghis Khan led his armies in the conquest of the Khwarezm Empire further west. Again and again, the Mongols used their favorite battle tactic in these encounters. Cavalry were sent to attack the enemy's main force. Feigning defeat, the cavalry retreated, drawing the opposing forces out of formation in the hope of a chance to slaughter the fleeing Mongols. Once the enemy's pursuit horsemen had spread themselves over the countryside, the main force of the Mongol heavy cavalry, until then concealed, attacked them with a devastating pincer formation, and the great cities of adversary powers fell to the new siege weapons and tactics the Mongols had perfected in their North China campaigns. Within 2 years, his once flourishing cities in ruin and his kingdoms in Mongol hands, Muhammad Shah, having retreated across his empire, died on a desolate island in the Caspian Sea. In addition to greatly enlarging his domains, Genghis Khan's victories meant that he could bring tens of thousands of Turkic horsemen into his armies. By 1227, the year of his death, the Mongols ruled an empire that stretched from eastern Persia to the North China Sea. Long-distance trade and cross-cultural exchange, life under the Mongol Imperium. Despite their aggressiveness as warriors and the destruction they could unleash on those who resisted their demands for submission and tribute, the Mongols were remarkably astute and tolerant rulers. Genghis Khan himself set the standard. He was a complex man, capable of gloating over the ruin of his enemies, but also open to new ideas and committed to building a world where the diverse peoples of his empire could live together in peace. Though illiterate, Genghis Khan was neither the ignorant savage nor the cultureless vandal often depicted in the accounts of civilized writers. Usually those who never met him. Once the conquered peoples had been subdued, he took a keen interest in their arts and learning, although he refused to live in their cities. Instead, he established a new kingdom at Karakorum on the steppes and summoned the wise and clever from all parts of the empire to the lavish palace of tents and gilded pillars where he lived with his wives and closest advisors. At Karakorum, Genghis Khan consulted with Confucian scholars about how to rule China, with Muslim engineers about how to build siege weapons and improve trade with the lands farther west, and the Taoist holy men, whom he hoped could give him an elixir that would make him immortal. Although he himself followed the shamanistic, focused on natural spirits, belief of his ancestors, all religions were tolerated in his empire. An administrative framework that drew on the advice and talents of both Muslim and Chinese bureaucrats was created. A script was devised for the Mongolian language to facilitate record-keeping and the standardization of laws. Genghis Khan's legal code was enforced by a specially designated policeman. Much of the code was aimed at ending the divisions and quarrels that had so long plagued the Mongols and other nomadic peoples. Grazing lands were allotted to special tribes, and harsh penalties were given for rustling livestock or stealing horses. The Mongol conquest brought a peace to much of Asia that in some areas persisted for generations. In the towns of the empire, handicraft production and scholarship flourished, and artistic creativity was allowed free expression. Secure trade routes made for prosperous merchants and wealthy cosmopolitan cities. One Muslim historian wrote of the peoples within the Mongol Empire that they enjoyed such a peace that a man might have journeyed from the land of sunrise to the land of sunset with a golden platter upon his head without suffering the least violence from anyone. Paradoxically, Mongol expansion, which sedentary chronicles condemned as barbarian orgy of violence and destruction, also became a major force of economic and social development and the enhancement of civilized life. But there was also a downside. The movement of merchants and commercial goods also facilitated the spread of disease. In fact, some historians believe that the infamous intercontinental wave of bubonic plague that came to be known as the Black Death was carried from China by the fleas on rats nesting in the saddlebags of Mongol cavalrymen across Central Asia to the Black Sea, from there by ships to the Mediterranean and Europe. The death of Genghis Khan and the division of the empire. In 1226, his wars to the west won. Genghis Khan turned east with an army of 180,000 warriors to complete the conquest of China that he regretted having left unfinished more than a decade earlier. After routing a much larger Tangut army in a battle fought on the frozen waters of the Yellow River, the Mongol armies overran the kingdom of Xia, plundering, burning, and mercilessly hunting down Tangut survivors. As his forces closed in on the Tangut capital and last refuge, Genghis Khan, who had been injured in a skirmish some months earlier, fell grievously ill. After lecturing his sons on the dangers of quarreling among themselves for the spoils of the empire, the Khagan died in August 1227. With one last outburst of wrath, this time directed against death itself, the Mongols carried his body back to Mongolia for burial. The Mongol forces, escorting the funeral process, hunted down and killed every human and animal in its path. The best pasture lands the Mongols could control were divided between Genghis Khan's 3 remaining sons and Batu, a grandson and heir of the Khagan's recently deceased son, Jochi. Towns and cultivated areas such as those in North China and parts of Persia were considered the common property of the Mongol ruling family. A Kurultai was convened at Karakorum, the Mongol capital, to select a successor to the great conqueror. In accordance with Genghis Khan's preference, Ogdi, his 3rd son, was elected Grand Khan. Though not as capable a military leader as his brother or nephews, Ogdi was a crafty diplomat and a deft manipulator. As it turned out, these skills were much needed to keep the ambitious heads of the vast provinces of the empire from each other's throats. For nearly a decade, Ogdi directed Mongol energies into further campaigns and conquests. The areas targeted by his new round of Mongol expansion paid the price for peace within the Mongol Empire. The fate of most important victims, Russia and Eastern Europe, the Islamic heartlands of China, will be the focus of much of the rest of this chapter. The Mongol drive to the west. Russia and Europe were added to the Mongols' agenda for world conquest. Subjugating these regions became the project of the armies of the Golden Horde, named after the golden tent of the early Khans of the western sect of the Mongol Empire. The territories of the Golden Horde made up one of the 4 great Khanates, into which the Mongol Empire was divided at the time of Genghis Khan's death. Map 14.2. Under the rule of Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu, Mongol armies began an invasion of Russia in 1236. In a very real sense, the assault on Russia was a side campaign, a chance to fine-tune the war machine and win a little booty on the way to the real prize, Western Europe. As we saw in Chapter 9, in the first half of the 13th century, when the Mongol warriors first descended, Russia had been divided into numerous petty kingdoms, centered on trading cities such as Novgorod and Kiev. See map 14.3. By this time, Kiev, which originally dominated much of central Russia, had been in decline for some time. As a result, there was no paramount power to rally Russian forces against the invaders, despite the warnings of those who had witnessed the crushing defeat suffered by the Georgians in the early 1220s. The princes of Russia refused to cooperate. They preferred to fight alone, and they were routed individually. In 1236, Batu led a Mongol force of more than 120,000 cavalrymen into the Russian heartlands. From 1237 to 1238, and later in 1240, these Tatars, or Tartars, meaning people from hell, as the Russians called them, carried out only successful winter invasions in Russian history. In fact, the Mongols preferred to fight in the winter. The frozen earth provided good footing for their horses, and frozen rivers gave them access to their enemies. One after another, the Mongol armies defeated the often much larger forces of local nomadic groups and Russian princes. Cities such as Ryazan, Moscow, and Vladimir, which resisted the Mongol command to surrender, were destroyed. Their inhabitants were slaughtered or led into slavery. As a contemporary Russian chronicler observed, no eye remained to weep for the dead. Just as it seemed all of Russia would be ravaged by the Mongols, whom the Russians compared to locust, Batu's armies withdrew. The largest cities, Novgorod and Kiev, appeared to have been spared. Russian priests thanked God, and Mongol commanders blaming the spring thaw, which slowed the Mongol horsemen and raised the risk of defeat in the treacherous mud. The Mongols returned in force in the winter of 1240. In the second campaign, even the great city of Kiev, which had reached a population of more than 100,000 by the end of the 12th century, fell. Enraged by Kievan resistance, its ruler had ordered the Mongol envoys thrown from the city walls. The Mongols reduced the greatest city in Russia to a smoldering ruin. The cathedral of St. Sophia was spared, but the rest of the city was looted and destroyed, and its inhabitants were smoked out and slaughtered. Novgorod braced itself for the Mongol onslaught. Again, according to the Russian chroniclers, it was miraculously spared. In fact, it was saved largely because of the willingness of its prince, Alexander Nevsky, spelled Nevskii, to submit, at least temporarily, to Mongol demands. In addition, the Mongol armies were eager to move on to the main event, the invasion of Western Europe. They were perceived as far richer, but equally vulnerable region. Russia in bondage. The crushing victories of Batu's armies, initially nearly 2.5 centuries of Mongol dominance in Russia. Russian princes were forced to submit as vassals of the Khan of the Golden Horde and to pay tribute. Mongol demands fell particularly heavy on the Russian peasantry, who had to give their crops and labor to both their own princes and the Mongol overlords. Impoverished and ever fearful of the lightning raids of Mongol marauders, the peasants fled to remote areas or became, in effort, the serfs, see Chapter 9, of the Russian ruling class in return for protection. Some Russian towns made profits on the increased trade made possible by the Mongol links. Sometimes the gains exceeded the tribute they paid to the Golden Horde. No town benefited from the Mongol presence more than Moscow. Badly plundered and partially burned in the early Mongol assaults, the city was gradually rebuilt, and its ruling princes steadily swallowed up nearby towns and surrounding villages. After 1328, Moscow also profited from its status as the tribute collector for Mongol Khans. Its princes not only used their position to fill their own coffers, but also annexed other towns as punishment for falling behind on tribute payments. As Moscow grew in strength, the power of the Golden Horde declined. Mongol religious toleration benefited from the Orthodox Church and Moscow. The choice of Moscow as the seat of the Orthodox leaders brought new sources of wealth to its princes and buttressed its claims to Russia's leading city. In 1380, those claims got an additional boost when the princes of Moscow shifted from being tribute collectors to being the defenders of Russia. In alliance with other Russian vassals, they raised an army that defeated the forces of the Golden Horde at the Battle of Kolikova. Their victory and the devastating blows Timur's attacks dealt the Golden Horde 2 decades later effectively broke the Mongol hold over Russia. Although much of the Mongols' impact was negative, their conquest was a turning point in the Russian history in several ways. In addition to their importance to Moscow and the Orthodox Church, Mongol contacts led to the changes in Russian military organization and tactics and in the political style of Russian rulers. Claims that the Tatars were responsible for Russian despotism, either Tsarist, spelled T-S-A-R-I-S-T, I'm assuming the T is silent, or Stalinist, are clearly overstated. Still, the Mongol example may have influenced the desire of Russian princes to centralize their control and reduce the limitations placed on their power by the landed nobility, clergy, and wealthy merchants. By far the greatest effects of Mongol rule were those resulting from Russia's isolation from Christian lands farther west. On one hand, the Mongols protected a divided and weak Russia from the attacks of much more powerful kingdoms such as Poland, Lithuania, and Hungary. Map 14.2. On the other hand, in the period of Mongol rule, Russia was cut off from key transformations in Western Europe that were inspired by the Renaissance and led ultimately to Reformation. Mongol incursions and the retreat from Europe. Until news of the Mongol campaigns in Russia reached European peoples such as the Germans, Poles, and Hungarians farther west. Christian leaders had been quite pleased by the rise of new military power in Central Asia. Rumors and reports from Christians living in the area, chafing under what they saw as persecution by their Muslim overlords, convinced many in Western Europe that the Mongol Khan had none other than Prester John. Prester John was the name given to a mythical, rich, and powerful Christian monarch whose kingdom was supposedly being cut off from Europe by the Muslim conquest of the 7th and 8th centuries. Sometimes located in Africa, sometimes in Central Asia, Prester John loomed large in the European imagination as a potential ally who could strike the Muslim enemy from the rear and join up with European Christians to destroy the common adversary. The Mongol assault on the Muslim Khwarezm Empire appeared to confirm the speculation that Genghis Khan was indeed Prester John. The assault on Christian, though Orthodox, Russia made it clear that the Mongol armies were neither the legions of Prester John nor partial to Christians than to any other people who stood in their way. The rulers of Europe were nevertheless slow to realize the magnitude of the threat the Mongols posed on Western Christendom. When Mongol envoys, one of whom was Englishman, arrived at the court of King Bela of Hungary, demanding that he surrender a group of nomads who had fled to his domains after being beaten by the Mongols in Russia, the king contemptuously dismissed them. King Bela also rebuffed Batu's demand that he submit to Mongol rule. The Hungarian monarch reasoned that he was the ruler of a powerful kingdom, whereas the Mongols were just another ragtag bag of nomads in search of easy plunder. His refusal to negotiate provided the Mongols with a pretext to invade. Their ambition remained the conquest and pillage of all Western Europe. This goal was clearly attained clearly attainable. That this goal was clearly attainable was demonstrated by the sound drubbing they gave to the Hungarians in 1240 and later to a mixed force of Christian knights led by the Polish ruler, King Henry of Silesia. These victories left the Mongols free to raid and pillage from the Adriatic Sea region in the south to Poland and the German states of the north. It also left the rest of Europe open to Mongol conquest. Just as the kings and clergy of the western portions of Christendom were beginning to fear the worst, Mongol forces disappeared. The death of Khagan Ogedi in the distant Mongol capital at Karakorum forced Batu to withdraw in preparation for the struggle for succession. The campaign for the conquest of Europe was never resumed. Perhaps Batu was satisfied with the huge empire of the Golden Horde that he ruled from his splendid new capital at Sarai, from the Volga River in what is southern Russia today. Most certainly, the Mongols had found richer lands to plunder in the following decades in the Muslim empires of the Middle East. Whatever the reason, Europe was spared the full fury of the Mongol assault. Of the civilizations that fringed the steep homelands of the Mongols, only India was as fortunate. The Mongol assault on the Islamic heartland. After the Mongol conquest of the Khwarazm, sometimes I say Khwarazm, it's actually Khwarazm. So anyway, I'll reread that sentence. After the Mongol conquest of the Khwarazm Empire, it was only a matter of time before they struck westward against the wealthier Muslim empires of Mesopotamia and North Africa, see map 7.2 and map 14.2. The conquest of these areas became the main project of Helegu, another grandson of Genghis Khan, and the ruler of the Ikhanhan portions of the Mongol Empire. As we saw in Chapter 7, one of the key results of Helegu's assaults on the Muslim heartlands was the capture and destruction of Baghdad in 1258, map 14.4. The murder of Abbasid Caliph, one of some 800,000 people who were reported to have been killed in Mongol retribution for the city's resistance, ended the dynasty that had ruled the core religions of the Islamic world since the mid-8th century. A major Mongol victory over the Seljuk Turks in 1243 also proved critical to the subsequent history of the region. It opened up Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, to conquest by different Turkic-speaking peoples, the Ottomans, who would eventually become the next great power in the Islamic heartlands. Given the fate of Baghdad, it is understandable that Muslim historians treated the coming of the Mongols as one of the great catastrophes in the history of Islam. The murder of the Caliph and his family left the faithful without a central authority. The sack of Baghdad and many other cities from Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean devastated the focal points of Islamic civilization. One contemporary Muslim chronicler, Ibn al-Athir, found the violence the Mongols had done to his people so horrific that he apologized to his readers for recounting it and wished that he had not been born to see it. He lamented, "In just 1 year, they seized the most populous, the most beautiful, and the best cultivated part of the earth, whose inhabitants excelled in character and urbanity. In the countries that have not been overrun by them, everyone spends the night afraid that they may yet appear there too. Thus, Islam and the Muslims were struck at that time by a disaster such as no people had experienced before. Given these reverses, one can imagine the relief the peoples of the Muslim world felt when the Mongols were finally defeated in 1260 by the armies of Mamluk, or slave, dynasty of Egypt. Ironically, Baybars, the commander of the Egyptian forces, and many of his lieutenants had been enslaved by the Mongols some years earlier and sold in Egypt, where they rose to power through military service. The Muslim victory was won with the rare cooperation of the Christians, who allowed Babar's forces to cross unopposed through their much diminished Crusader territories in Palestine. Christian support demonstrated how far the former Crusader states had gone in accommodating their more powerful Muslim neighbors. Hulagu was in Central Asia, engaging in another succession struggle when the battle occurred. Upon his return, he was forced to reconsider his plans for a conquest of the entire Muslim world. The Mamluks were deeply entrenched and growing stronger. Hulagu was threatened by his cousin Berke, spelled Berke, the new Khan of the Golden Horde to the north, who had converted to Islam. After openly clashing with Berke and learning of Babur's overtures for an alliance with the Golden Horde, Hulagu decided to settle for the kingdom he already ruled, which stretched from the frontiers of Byzantium to the Amu Darya Oxus River in Central Asia, 14.2. The Mongol interlude in Chinese history. Soon after Ogedei was elected as the Great Khan, the Mongol advice in China was resumed. Having conquered the Xi-Xia and Jin empires, the Mongol commanders turned to what remained of the Song Empire in South China, maps 14.1 and 14.2. In the campaigns against the Song, the Mongol forces were directed by Kublai Khan. I've been saying it as Kublai. It's actually Kubla. So, yeah, as the pronunciation says right here. So it's Kublai Khan, figure 14.5. Kubla was one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan, and he would play a pivotal role in Chinese history for the next half-century. Even under a decadent dynasty that had long neglected its defenses, South China was one of the toughest areas for the Mongols to conquer. From 1235 to 1279, the Mongols were constantly on the march. They fought battle after battle and besieged seemingly innumerable, well-fortified Chinese cities. In 1260, Kublai assumed the title of the Great Khan, much of the chagrin of his sons, who ruled other parts of the empire. A decade later, in 1271, on the recommendation of Chinese advisors, he changed the name of his Mongol regime to a Chinese-language dynastic title, the Yuan, spelled Y-U-A-N. I'm going to say Yuan. Although he was still nearly a decade away from fully defeating the last-ditch efforts of Confucian bureaucrats and Chinese generals to save the Song dynasty, Kublai ruled most of China. He now set about the task of establishing more permanent Mongol control. As the different regions of China came under Mongol rule, Kublai passed many laws to preserve the distinction between Mongol and Chinese. He forbade Chinese scholars to learn the Mongol script, which was used for records and correspondence at the upper levels of the imperial government. Mongols were forbidden to marry ethnic Chinese, and only women from nomadic families were selected for the imperial harem. Even friendship between two people were discouraged, and Mongol military forces remained separate from the Chinese. Mongol religious ceremonies and customs were retained, and a tent encampment in the traditional Mongol style was set up in the imperial city, even though Kublai usually lived in a Chinese-style palace. Despite the measures to ensure that the conquering Mongol minority was not completely absorbed by the culture of the defeated, Kublai Khan had long been fascinated by Chinese civilization. Even before beginning the conquest of the Song Empire, he had surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, some Buddhist, other Taoist or Confucian. His capital at Dadu in the north, present-day Beijing, was built by the site occupied by earlier dynasties. He introduced Chinese rituals and classical music into his own court. Kublai also put the empire on the Chinese calendar and offered sacrifices to his ancestors at a special temple in the imperial city, but he rebuffed the pleas of his Confucian advisors to reestablish the civil service exams, which he had discontinued by the Jin rulers. In
Yuan era, a new social structure was established in China, with the Mongols on top and their Central Asian nomadic and Muslim allies right below them in the hierarchy. These two groups occupied most offices at the highest levels of the bureaucracy. Beneath them came the North Chinese, below them the ethnic Chinese and the minority peoples of the South. Thus, ethnic Chinese from both North and South ran the Yuan bureaucracy at the regional and local levels, but they could exercise power at the top only as advisors to the Mongols or other nomadic officials. At all levels, their activities were scrutinized by Mongol functionaries from an enlarged and much strengthened Censors Bureau, spelled Bureau. Bureau. Yeah, I'm going to say Bureau. Gender roles and convergence of Mongol and Chinese culture. Mongol women remained aloof from Chinese culture, at least Chinese culture in its Confucian guise. They refused to adopt the practice of foot binding, which so limited the activities of Chinese women. They retained their rights to property and control within the house, as well as the freedom to move about the town and countryside. No more striking evidence of their independence can be found than contemporary accounts of Mongol women riding to the hunt, both with their husbands and at the head of their own hunting parties. The daughter of one of Kubla's cousins went to war, and she refused to marry until one of her many suitors were able to throw her in a wrestling match. The persisting influence of Mongol women after the Mongols settled down in China is exemplified by Cha Bi, the wife of Kubla Khan, figure 14.6. She was one of Kubla's most important confidants in political and diplomatic matters, and she promoted Buddhist interests in the highest circles of government. Chabli played a critical role in fostering policies aimed at reconciling the majority ethnic Chinese population of the empire to Mongol rule. She convinced Kubla that the harsh treatment of the survivors of the defeated Song imperial family would only anger the peoples of North China and make them more difficult to rule. On another occasion, she demonstrated that she shared Kubla's respect for Chinese culture by frustrating a plan to turn cultivated lands near the capital into pasture lands for the Mongols' ponies. Thus, the imperial couple was a good match of astute political skills and cosmopolitanism, tempered by respect for their own traditions and determination to preserve those they found the most valuable. The Mongol era was too brief, and the number of influential Mongol women too small to reverse the trends that for centuries had been lowering the position of women in Chinese society. As Neo-Confucianism gained ground under Kubla's successors, the arguments for confining women multiplied. Ultimately, even women of the Mongol ruling class saw their freedoms and power reduced. Mongol tolerance and foreign cultural influence. Like Genghis Khan and other Mongol overlords, Kubla and Chabi had unbounded curiosity and very cosmopolitan tastes. Their generous patronage drew scholars, artists, artisans, and office seekers from many lands to the splendid Yuan court. Some of the most favored came from Muslim kingdoms to the east that had come under Mongol rule. Muslims were included in the second highest social grouping, just beneath the Mongols themselves. Persians and Turks were admitted to the inner circle of Kubla's administrators and advisors. Muslims designed and supervised the building of the Chinese-style imperial city and proposed new systems for more efficient tax collection. Persian astronomers imported more advanced Middle Eastern instruments for celestial observations, corrected the Chinese calendar, and made some of the most accurate maps the Chinese ever seen. Muslim doctors ran the imperial hospitals and added translations for 36 volumes of Muslim medicine to the imperial library. In addition to the Muslims, Kubla welcomed travelers and missionaries from many foreign lands to his court. Like his father, Kubla had a strong interest in all religions and insisted on toleration in his domains. Buddhist, Nestorian Christians, Taoists, and Latin Christians made their way to his court. The most renowned of the latter were members of the Polo family from Venice in northern Italy, who traveled extensively in the Mongol Empire in the middle of the 13th century. Marco Polo's account of Kublai Khan's court and empire, where he lived and served as an administrator for 17 years, is perhaps the most famous travel account written by a European, figure 14.7. Marco accepted fantastic tales of grotesque and strange customs, and he may have taken parts of his account from other sources. Still, his descriptions of the palaces, cities, and wealth of Kublai's empire enhanced European interest in Asia and helped to inspire efforts of navigators such as Columbus to find a water route to these fabled lands. Social policies and scholar gentry resistance. Kublai's efforts to promote Mongol adaptation to Chinese culture were overshadowed in the long run by measures to preserve Mongol separateness. The ethnic Chinese, who made up the vast majority of the subjects, particularly in the south, were never really reconciled to Mongol rule. Despite Kublai's cultivation of Confucian rituals and his extensive employment of Chinese bureaucrats, most of the scholar gentry saw the Mongol overlord and his successors as uncouth barbarians whose policies endangered Chinese traditions. As it intended to do, Kublai's refusal to reinstate the examination route to his administrative office prevented Confucian scholars from dominating politics. The favoritism he showed Mongol and other foreign officials further alienated the scholar gentry. To add insult to injury, Kublai went to great lengths to bolster the position of the artisan classes, who had never enjoyed high standing, and the merchants, whom the Confucian thinkers had long dismissed as parasites. From the outset, the Mongols had shown great regard for artisans, and because their useful skills had often spared them while killing their fellow city dwellers. During the Yuan period in China, merchants also prospered and commerce boomed, probably because of the Mongol efforts to improve transportation and expand supply of paper money. With amazing speed for a people who had no prior experience with seafaring, the Mongols developed a substantial navy, which played a major role in the conquest of the Song Empire. After the conquest of China was completed, the great Mongol war fleets were used to put down pirates who threatened river and overseas commerce. Toward the end of Kublai's reign, the navy also launched a number of overseas expeditions of exploration and conquest, which led to attacks on Japan and a brief reoccupation of Vietnam. Ironically, despite the Mongols' suspicion of cities and sedentary lifestyles, both flourished in the Yuan era. The urban expansion began under the Tang and Song dynasties continued, and the Mongol elite soon became addicted to the diversions of urban life. Traditional Chinese artistic endeavors, such as pottery and essay writing, languished under the Mongols in comparison with their flowering in the Tang and Song eras. But popular entertainments, particularly musical dramas, flourished. Perhaps the most famous Chinese dramatic work, The Romance of the West Chamber, was written in the Yuan period. Dozens of major playwrights wrote for the court, the major merchant class, and the Mongol elite. Actors and actresses, who had long been relegated by the Confucian scholars to the despised status of mean people, achieved celebrity and social esteem. All this rankled the scholar gentry, who waited for the chance to restore Confucian decorum and what they believed to be the proper social hierarchy for a civilized people. Initially, at least, Kublai Khan pursued policies toward one social group, the peasants that the scholarly class would have heartily approved. He forbade Mongol cavalrymen from turning croplands into pasture and restoring the granary system for famine relief that had been badly neglected in the late Song. Kublai also sought to reduce peasant tax and forced labor burdens, partly by redirecting peasant payments from local non-official tax farmers directly to government officials. He and his advisors also developed a revolutionary plan to establish elementary education in the villages. Although the level of learning they envisioned was rudimentary, such a project, if they had been enacted, would have been a major challenge to the educational system centered on the elite that long had dominated Chinese civilization. The fall of the House of Yuan. Historians often remark on the seeming contradiction between the military prowess of the Mongol conquerors and the short life of the dynasty they lived in China. Kublai Khan's long reign encompassed a good portion of the 9 decades in which the Mongols ruled all of China. Already, by the end of this reign, the dynasty was showing signs of weakening. Song loyalists raised revolts in the south, and popular hostility toward the foreign overlords was expressed more and more openly. The Mongol aura of military invincibility was badly tarnished by Kublai's rebuffs at the hands of the military lords of Japan, and failure of the expeditions that he sent to punish them, first in 1274, and again in a much larger effort in 1280. The defeats suffered by Mongol forces engaged in similar expeditions to Vietnam and Java during the same period further undermined the Mongol standing. Kublai's dissolute lifestyle in his later years, partly brought on by the death of his most beloved wife, Shabi, and 5 years later the death of his favorite son, led to the general softening of the Mongol ruling class as a whole. Kublai's successors lacked his capacity for leadership and cared little for the tedium of day-to-day administrative tasks. Many of the Muslim and Chinese functionaries to whom they entrusted the imperial finances enriched themselves through graft and corruption. This greatly angered the hard-pressed peasantry, who bore the burden of rising taxes and demands for forced labor. The scholar gentry played on this discontent by calling on the people to rise up and overthrow the barbarian usurpers. By the 1350s, the signs of dynastic decline were apparent. Banditry and piracy were widespread, and the government's forces were too weak to curb them. Famine hit many regions and spawned local uprisings, which engulfed large portions of the empire. Secret religious sects, such as the White Lotus Society, were dedicated to overthrowing the dynasty. Their leaders' claims that they had magical powers to heal their followers and confound their enemies helped encourage further peasant resistance against the Mongols. As in the past, rebel leaders quarreled and fought with each other. For a time, chaos reigned as the Yuan regime dissolved, and the Mongols could escape the fury of the mob retreated into Central Asia. The restoration of peace and order came from an unexpected quarter. Rather than a regional military commander or an aristocratic lord, a man from a poor peasant family, Zhu Wangzhang, I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, but I'm going to say Zhu Wangzhang, emerged to found the Ming Dynasty, which ruled China for most of the next 3 centuries. Aftershock, the brief ride of Timur. Aftershock, the brief ride of Timur, the last of the great nomadic conquerors. Just as the peoples of Europe and Asia had begun to recover from the upheavals caused by the Mongol expansion, a second nomadic outburst from Central Asia plunged them again into fear and despair. This time, the Mongols in question were Turks, not Mongols, and their leader, Timur I Lang, Timur the Lame, or Timurlane, was from a noble land-owning clan, not a tribal herding background. Figure 14.8. Timur's personality was complex. On one hand, he was a highly cultured person who delighted in the fine arts, lush gardens, and splendid architecture, who could spend days conversing with great scholars such as Muslim historian Ibn Khaldun. See the document featured in Chapter 7. On the other hand, he was a ruthless conqueror, apparently indifferent to human suffering, and capable of commanding his troops to commit atrocities on a scale that would not be matched in the human experience until the 20th century. Beginning in the 1360s, his armies moved out from his base at Samarkand to conquests in Persia, the Fertile Crescent, India, and southern Russia. Although his empire did not begin to compare with that of the Mongols in size, he outdid them in the ferocity of his campaigns. In fact, Timur is remembered for little more than barbaric destruction. His armies built pyramids of skulls with the heads of those they killed. Tens of thousands of people were slaughtered after they took the city of Aleppo in Asia Minor, and thousands of prisoners were massacred as a warning to the citizens of Delhi and northern India not to resist his armies. In the face of this wanton slaughter, the fact that he spared artisans and scientists to embellish his capital city at Samarkand counts for little. Unlike that of the Mongols, his rule brought neither increased trade and cross-cultural exchanges nor internal peace. Fortunately, his reign was as brief as it was violent. After his death in 1405, his empire was pulled apart by his warring commanders and old enemies anxious for revenge. With this passing, the last great challenge of the steppe nomads to the civilizations of Eurasia came to an end. Global connections, the Mongol linkages. From the first explosion of Mongol military might from the steppes of Central Asia in the early 13th century to the death of Timur in 1405, the nomads of Central Asia made a stunning return to central stage in world history. Mongol invasions ended or interrupted many of the great empires of post-classical period and also extended the world network that had increasingly defined the period. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols and their many nomadic neighbors were forged into the mightiest war machine the world had ever seen. With stunning rapidity, the Mongols conquered Central Asia, North China, and Eastern Persia, map 14.1. Under Genghis Khan's son and grandsons, the rest of China, Tibet, Persia, Iraq, much of Asia Minor, and all of southern Russia were added to the vast Mongol imperium. Although much of what the Mongols did was destructive, their forays into Europe, China, and Muslim heartlands brought some lasting changes that were often beneficial. They taught new ways of making war and impressed on their Turkic and European enemies the effectiveness of gunpowder. Mongol conquest facilitated trade between the civilizations at each end of Eurasia, making possible the exchange of foods, tools, and ideas on an unprecedented scale. The revived routes brought great wealth to traders, such as those from North Italy, who set up outposts in the eastern Mediterranean, along the Black Sea coast, and as far as the Caspian Sea. Land-based travel more dangerous, which quickly turned attention towards sea routes. Again, the legacy of the Mongol period was both complex and durable. Perhaps the greatest long-term impact of the Mongol drive to the west was indirect and unintended. In recent years, a growing number of historians have come convinced that the Mongol conquest played a key role in transmitting the fleas that carried bubonic plague from South China and Central Asia to Europe and the Middle East. The fleas have hitched a ride on the livestock the Mongols drove into the new pasture lands won by their conquests, or on the rats that nibbled the grain transported by merchants along trading routes the Mongol rulers fostered between east and west. Whatever the exact connection, the Mongol armies unknowingly paved the way for the spread of the dreaded Black Death across the steppes to much of China, to the Islamic heartlands, and from there to most of Europe in the mid-14th century. In doing so, they unleashed possibly the most fatal epidemic in human history. From mortality rates higher than 50% in some areas of Europe and Middle East to the economic and social adjustments that the plagues forced wherever it spread, this accidental but devastating side effect of the Mongol conquest influenced the course of civilized development in Europe, Asia, and North Africa for centuries. And that is it for chapter 14.